My name is Martha Reynolds. I'm 65. And after 35 years of loyalty, my new boss tried to trick me out of my retirement just to save a few bucks. Her lawyers called me 48 hours later begging me to come back. But by then, it was already too late for them. It's a long story, the kind that brews over decades of quiet dedication and comes to a head in a flash of brutal disrespect. So, pour yourself a cup of coffee, or maybe something a little stronger if the day calls for it. It's about 2 p.m. here in sunny Florida, where I finally landed after the storm passed. I'd love to know where you're all listening from today and what time it is in your part of the world. Let me know in the comments below. It makes the world feel a little smaller, doesn't it? And believe me, for a while there, my world had shrunk to a very dark and lonely place. And I could have used a friend. This is the story of how I found my way out. The first sign of trouble wasn't a thunderclap. It was a whisper. It was the scent of expensive, sharp-edged perfume, something called Oud Imperial, I later learned, cutting through a hallway that for 3 decades had smelled of nothing more threatening than industrial floor wax and the comforting scent of old paper files. Her name was Rebecca Winters, and she was the new CEO of Horizon Technologies, the company I had called my second home for 35 years. I was the director of internal compliance. It's not a glamorous title, and it was never meant to be. It doesn't get you a corner office with a panoramic view of the Chicago skyline. It gets you a functional, beige-walled space on the 17th floor filled with fireproof filing cabinets in the quiet, constant hum of a dedicated server. My job was to be the company's conscience, its institutional memory. I was the one who knew why a certain liability clause was written into a vendor contract back in 1998 following a messy lawsuit. I was the one who could pull the file on a supplier from 20 years ago and tell you exactly why we stopped doing business with them. My late husband, Robert, who was a brilliant VP of engineering here before he passed away far too soon, used to call me the gatekeeper. I always thought it was a loving joke, a nod to my serious nature. I never realized how prophetic that title would become. Rebecca was everything I wasn't. She was 40, with a predatory smile that never quite reached her cold, calculating eyes. She had a Wharton MBA, which she mentioned within the first 5 minutes of any conversation, and the kind of restless, kinetic energy that made older, slower, more deliberate things and people seem like obstacles in her path. She wore stark, minimalist suits in shades of black, white, and blood red, and her office was a monument to her personality. The warm, dark cherry wood and leather armchairs of our founder, Mr. Albright, were gone overnight. They were replaced by a sterile landscape of glass, chrome, and a single enormous abstract painting that looked to me like a scream, rendered in angry slashes of color. For the first few months, she was a master of corporate charm. She made a great show of having one-on-one lunches with all the senior staff. "Martha, you're a legend," she'd said to me, pushing a piece of kale around her plate in the executive dining room. "A veritable institution. We need your wisdom, your historical perspective as we navigate the exciting future of Horizon." I nodded and smiled, my own Cobb salad untouched. My gut, an organ I'd learned to trust more than any financial projection, felt a cold knot tightening. Her flattery was a tool, like the expensive pen she clicked incessantly. She wasn't seeking wisdom, she was assessing threats. The whisper of trouble became a low murmur the day she brought in her own team, a Praetorian guard to protect her new empire. James Parker as COO, a man with a bone-crushing handshake and the vacant eyes of a shark, and Michael Thompson as CFO, a perpetually nervous man who couldn't look you in the eye and whose hands always seemed to be damp. They moved through the company like a cold front, their conversations peppered with aggressive corporate jargon, streamlining, optimizing for shareholder value, and most ominously, trimming the fat. I, with my top-tier salary, my meticulous, time-consuming adherence to protocol, and my 35 years of accumulated benefits, knew I was being sized up as the prize-winning hog. Then came the day of the gilded cage. It was a Tuesday. Rebecca called me into her sterile office. The brilliant Chicago sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside, the air conditioning was cranked so high, it felt like a meat locker. She didn't sit behind her massive glass desk, a classic power move. Instead, she gestured for me to join her on a low, brutally uncomfortable leather couch that must have been designed by a sadist. A thick, glossy portfolio, bound in dark blue leather, sat on the chrome coffee table between us. "Martha," she began, her voice as smooth and cool as the glass tabletop, "we've been talking a great deal in our leadership meetings about the future and about your incredible legacy here at Horizon." I said nothing. I just listened. I knew this was a performance, and my role was to be the silent, grateful audience. "We've put together a special early retirement package for you. It's significant. A golden handshake for our golden girl." I picked it up. It was heavy. The pages were thick, creamy, and smelled of expensive ink and deceit. I opened it. The first page was a summary, filled with impressive-looking numbers. A generous severance payout, a healthcare stipend for 5 years. It looked good. On a quick glance, it looked too good. "We want you to enjoy your life, Martha," Rebecca continued, her voice dripping with a fake, cloying sincerity that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "The grind, that's what she called my life's work, my dedication, my guardianship." I flipped past the summary page, my eyes scanning the dense, single-spaced legal text that followed. I had helped write the company's first employee benefits handbook back in 1988. I knew the architecture of these documents. I knew where companies hid the trapdoors. And then I found it, buried on page 7, paragraph 4, subsection C. It was a masterpiece of malicious legal drafting, a cleverly worded clause that tied the acceptance of the special package to my immediate departure, which would officially classify my exit as a voluntary resignation. This classification, in turn, would void the much larger, fully vested pension and the substantial stock options I was due to receive in just 4 months on my official 36th anniversary of employment. The difference wasn't in the thousands or tens of thousands, it was a 7-figure discrepancy.
They weren't giving me a gift. They were trying to trick me into selling my future for pennies on the dollar. They were gutting my retirement, the safety net Robert and I had so carefully planned, the inheritance I intended to leave for our children and grandchildren, the financial security for my old age. All of it, wrapped up in a pretty blue bow and presented with a predatory smile. I looked up from the portfolio, my face a carefully constructed mask of polite neutrality. Rebecca was watching me, that polished smile firmly in place, her eyes searching for a flicker of weakness or confusion. She thought I was a relic, a sweet, simple old woman who would be dazzled by the big numbers on the first page and miss the dagger hidden in the fine print. She had made the first, critical mistake of every truly arrogant person. She had profoundly, catastrophically underestimated her opponent. "This is very generous, Rebecca," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "It's a lot to take in. A very pleasant surprise." I closed the portfolio with a soft thud. "You'll have to give me a day or two to go over it with my daughter, to think about it." Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a micro-expression of annoyance that I registered with grim satisfaction. She thought I was a relic, a sweet, simple old woman who would be dazzled by the big numbers on the first page and miss the dagger hidden in the fine print. She had made the first, critical mistake of every truly arrogant person. She had profoundly, catastrophically underestimated her opponent. "This is very generous, Rebecca," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "It's a lot to take in. A very pleasant surprise. I closed the portfolio with a soft thud. You'll have to give me a day or two to go over it with my daughter. To think about it. Her smile faltered for just a fraction of a second, a micro expression of annoyance that I registered with grim satisfaction. She had expected immediate, tearful, grateful acceptance. Of course, she said, recovering so quickly a lesser observer would have missed it. Take all the time you need. We just want what's best for you. I stood up, the heavy portfolio in my hand, feeling like a formal declaration of war. As I walked out of her office, the cold air blasting from the vents felt like the Arctic winds of a coming storm. I didn't know the details yet. I didn't know the precise shape of the battlefield. But I knew one thing with the kind of absolute certainty that settles deep in your bones. This wasn't just about my retirement anymore. This was about justice. The thing about a career in compliance is that it teaches you to see the world in patterns. You learn that big corporate disasters, like earthquakes, never start with the big one. They start with a series of tiny, almost imperceptible foreshocks. A single number in the wrong column of a ledger, a signature on a contract that looks just a little too rushed, an expense report that doesn't quite add up. My entire professional life was dedicated to detecting those tremors before they could grow strong enough to shatter the foundation of the company. And for months, even before Rebecca's gilded cage was so graciously offered, I had been feeling the tremors. They were small at first, easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. A new vendor contract for an IT security firm pushed through the approval process with unusual speed by James Parker. I'd run a background check. The company was less than a year old and registered to a P.O. box in Delaware. When I flagged it, James had laughed it off in a hallway conversation. They're a hungry startup, Martha. Agile. We got a great price. You gotta be nimble in today's market. Then there was an expense report from James that included over $10,000 in client entertainment costs at a high-end steakhouse on a weekend he was supposedly on a private fishing trip in Montana. The receipt was vague. When I requested a list of clients entertained, his assistant sent back a curt email saying it was a, quote, sensitive preliminary discussion and the names were confidential. The biggest tremor came from Michael Thompson's office. There was a sudden, unannounced shift in how international fund transfers were being categorized. Large sums were being moved under a new, nebulous heading called Intersubsidiary Strategic Realignment. It was financial gibberish, designed to be opaque. When I scheduled a meeting to discuss it, Michael had been evasive, blaming the changes on a, quote, new, more efficient accounting software, and assuring me it was all above board. He promised to send the documentation. It never arrived. I wasn't a fool. I knew these weren't isolated incidents or simple oversights. They were tests. They were dropping small pebbles into the water to see how big the ripples would be. They were checking the fences of the pasture to see if the old gatekeeper was still watching. I was. And I was taking notes. The first time I challenged them directly and publicly was in the quarterly budget meeting in the main boardroom. The air was thick with tension. Michael Thompson was at the podium, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation filled with optimistic charts and upward-trending arrows. He got to a slide that detailed a massive multi-million-dollar write-off for something he called accelerated asset depreciation in our overseas logistics division. The term was vague, the numbers were suspiciously round, and it smelled to high heaven of a sludge fund being created. When he finished, and the chairman asked for questions, I let a bead of silence pass before I spoke. Michael, I said, my voice calm and even, cutting through the quiet of the room. That's a significant write-off. Could you provide the itemized breakdown for that depreciation? I'll need a detailed asset list with individual valuations for the quarterly compliance review. The room went utterly silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick carpet. All eyes turned from me to Michael. A deep, blotchy red flush crept up his neck. He started shuffling his papers, avoiding my gaze. James Parker, the COO, shifted in his seat, his jaw tight. Rebecca, seated at the head of the table, didn't even look at me. She just stapled her long, elegant fingers, a small, tight, unreadable smile. She was enjoying this. "Of course, Michael. Of course, Martha," he stammered, his voice a full octave higher than usual. It's a complex matter, a lot of moving parts. We'll get that to you." "Thank you," I said, my tone unwavering. "It's important to keep these open for transparency to ensure our SEC filing is on schedule." I wasn't just asking. I was creating a public record of my request. I was putting them on the clock. Later that day, Rebecca's executive assistant, a young woman who always looked like she was on the verge of tears, called my office. "Ms. Winters would like to see you." In her Arctic office, Rebecca was the picture of feigned concern. She gestured me to the hated couch again. "Martha, are you feeling all right? You seemed a little confrontational in the meeting today. It put Michael in a very awkward position." "I was doing my job, Rebecca," I said simply. There was no point in pretending otherwise. "I know," she cooed, her voice a condescending purr. "And you're the best at it, no one is questioning that. But we have a new way of doing things here at Horizon. We're more agile now, faster. Sometimes the old, rigid protocols can create bottlenecks. They stifle innovation. We need to trust the team. Michael is a top CFO. He knows what he's doing." The message was crystal clear. It wasn't just a suggestion to back off. It was a command wrapped in the language of corporate doublespeak. She was telling me I was obsolete. She was painting me as a relic, a bureaucratic hurdle in her sleek, modern, and corrupt machine. It was a classic power play. Isolate the dissenter, frame them as the problem, and undermine their authority in front of their peers. It was smart. It was ruthless. And it was a full confirmation of everything I had been fearing. I left her office that day knowing that the official channels, the ones I had relied on for my entire career, were being systematically closed to me. If I was going to protect this company, I couldn't do it from my desk during business hours anymore. I had to build my own arc. That night, I stayed late. The cleaning crew, most of whom I knew by name, nodded to me as they emptied the trash bins. Maria, a kind woman from Ecuador whose son's college fund I'd hoped her set up a tax-advantaged savings plan for, stopped her cart by my door. "You look tired, Mrs. Reynolds. Everything okay?" "Just a long day, Maria," I smiled, trying to reassure her. "Just tying up some loose ends before I head home." But I wasn't tying up ends. I was gathering threads. In the quiet solitude of my office, with the city lights twinkling like a distant galaxy outside my window, I began a new, clandestine project. On my way home, I stopped at a Best Buy and bought a high-capacity 2-terabyte external hard drive. I paid in cash. From then on, my routine changed. Every night after everyone else had gone home, I would begin my real work. I went through the day's records with a fine-tooth comb. Any suspicious email, I printed a hard copy for a physical file and saved a digital version to my new encrypted drive. Any contract that felt rushed, any financial report that had been revised multiple times without explanation, any meeting minutes where a key decision was glossed over, it all went into the arc. I created a separate, heavily password-protected file on my home computer. I became a forensic accountant in my spare time. I cross-referenced everything. I built a timeline that was far more detailed than anything the official records would show. The late-night meetings between Rebecca, James, and Michael that never appeared on the official company calendar. The sudden, inexplicable promotion of a junior accountant in Michael's department who seemed terrified of his own shadow. The formation of a series of new shell corporations in Delaware, all listed as consultants to Horizon. I felt a grim, lonely sense of purpose. This wasn't snooping. This was my fundamental duty, the very essence of the job they were trying to stop me from performing. I was the guardian of corporate integrity, and my fortress was under siege from its own queen. If they were going to burn it down for the insurance money, I was going to have a perfect, unassailable record of how they gathered the kindling, poured the gasoline, and lit the match. I was no longer just the gatekeeper. I was the historian of their downfall. I just didn't know how soon, or how brutally, that downfall would come. The night after Rebecca's generous offer, I drove home in a complete daze. The familiar Chicago streets, the headlights of other cars blurring into long streaks in the misty rain, they all felt alien. My house, usually my sanctuary of warmth, order, and quiet comfort, felt cavernous and cold. I walked through the rooms, the plush carpet muffling my footsteps, and the silence was a physical weight. It wasn't the peaceful silence of solitude. It was the hollow silence of a life's work being casually, cruelly erased. I went through the motions of my evening routine. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, my hands moving on autopilot. I sat at my polished oak dining table, the one that Robert and I had bought at a dusty antique store on our 20th anniversary. He had loved this house. He had loved this company. Before he passed away from a sudden, massive heart attack 5 years ago, so much of our shared life, our identity as a couple, had revolved around Horizon. It was where we met in the company cafeteria. It was where we built our careers in parallel. It was where we made lifelong friends, people who had celebrated our promotions and mourned our losses. After his funeral, when the casserole stopped coming and the house felt unbearably empty, coming back to work was what saved me. The routine, the purpose, the familiar faces, it was my lifeline in a sea of grief. And now, they were trying to cut it. Not with a clean, honest severance, but with a trick, a con. I sat there in the dim light of the dining room, the steam from my tea curling into the air like a departing ghost, and for the first time in a very, very long time, I let the mask of professional composer drop into dust. The steely resolve, the quiet dignity, it all crumbled into dust. A deep, shuddering sob escaped my throat, a sound so raw and painful it startled me. It wasn't about the money, not really, not at its core. It was the profound personal insult, the utter contemptuous dismissal of 35 years of my life, my loyalty, my very identity. I had poured my heart and soul into that place. I had sacrificed weekends for emergency audits, missed school plays for quarterly reports, worked through vacations to close a deal. I did it because I believed in what we were building. I believed in the integrity Mr. Albright, our founder, had instilled in every one of us. To them, to Rebecca and her new guard, I was just a line item on a budget, an expensive piece of old furniture to be discarded to make room for their sleek, modern, and morally bankrupt designs. The tears streamed down my face, hot and bitter. It was the grief of a profound betrayal, the kind you only feel when it comes from a place you considered home, from people who hold your future in their hands. I felt foolish. I felt naive. I felt old. And for a terrible moment, I wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe I was just a relic, a dinosaur, who couldn't adapt to their new, brutal world. For a long, dark hour, I let myself drown in it. I let the despair wash over me, a cold, heavy tide. The fight went out of me, replaced with a hollow, aching exhaustion. Maybe I should just take the deal, sign the papers, take the diminished payout, and disappear into a quiet, financially precarious retirement. It would be easier. It would be quieter. Who was I, after all, to take on a titan like Rebecca Winters? She had a board of directors, a team of ruthless lawyers, and the full power of a multi-billion-dollar corporation behind her. I was one woman, a widow in her 60s. What could it possibly do? I got it from the table and walked almost like a sleepwalker into Robert's old study, which had become my home office. My arc. The small rhythmic blinking of the external hard drive's indicator light seemed to mock me from the corner of the desk. What was the point of all that evidence, all those late nights, if I didn't have the will to use it?
My eyes fell on a framed photograph on the corner of the desk. It was a snapshot from a few years ago of Robert and me with our daughter, Sarah, and her little girl, my granddaughter, Emily, at her 5th birthday party. In the photo, Emily is beaming, a smear of chocolate frosting on her cheek, her hands gripping the handlebars of a brand new pink bicycle with training wheels. I remembered that day so vividly. The sun was shining, the air smelled of cut grass and barbecue. Robert had just gotten a big promotion to vice president. We felt invincible, like the world was ours. We were planning our future, talking about Emily's college fund, about the trips we would take when we finally retired. We had a plan, a solid, dependable plan, built on a foundation of hard work and the promise of this company to take care of its own. Looking at Robert's smiling, handsome face, I could almost hear his voice, that warm, steady baritone that had always been my anchor in any storm. "Don't you let them erase you, Marty," I could hear him say. "Don't you dare let them diminish you." And then another memory surfaced, pushing through the fog of my despair. Eleanor Blackwell, a formidable, whip-smart woman in her 70s, the last remaining board member from Mr. Albright's era, and a dear friend of my late husband. We had lunch every few months, a tradition we'd kept up after Robert was gone. At our last meeting, just a few weeks ago, she had looked at me over her teacup in the quiet corner of a downtime restaurant, her eyes sharp with a familiar concern. "There's a rot setting in, Martha," she had said quietly, her voice low. "A worship of profit above all else. A new culture that sees loyalty as a liability. Be careful." The despair began to recede, burned away by a slow-burning ember of righteous anger. This wasn't just my fight. It was for Robert and the legacy of integrity he believed in. It was for the inheritance I wanted to leave for Sarah and Emily. An inheritance of not just money, but of values. The knowledge that you stand up for what is right, no matter how powerful the opposition. It was for every loyal employee who trusted the company to do right by them. It was for Eleanor's quiet faith and for Mr. Albright's founding principles. They had mistaken my professionalism for weakness. They had mistaken my quietness for passivity. They had mistaken my age for irrelevance. They thought they could bully and cheat me into submission. The tears stopped. I wiped my face with the back of my hand, my gesture firm, decisive. I went back to the kitchen, poured the cold, untouched chamomile tea down the sink, and made myself a fresh, strong cup of black coffee. The breaking point had passed. The storm of grief had broken, and in its wake, something hard and clear and unshakable had formed. The gatekeeper was back at her post, and she was no longer just defending the fortress. She was preparing to lay siege. The next morning, I walked into the towering glass and steel edifice of Horizon Technologies with a sense of cold, surgical clarity I hadn't felt in months. The pity party was over. The tears were dried. It was time for the performance of a lifetime. I dressed for the part with meticulous care. Not in one of my usual conservative, dark-colored business suits, which were my professional armor. Instead, I chose a softer, lavender-colored cashmere twin set. I wanted to look less like a formidable compliance director and more like a gentle, slightly overwhelmed grandmother who was trying to do the right thing. I even wore the single-strand pearl necklace Robert had given me for our 30th anniversary. It was all part of the costume, a carefully curated image of harmlessness. My first stop was my own department. I gathered my small team of 4 people I had hired, mentored, and protected for years. I told them, my voice filled with a convincing blend of excitement and nostalgia,
that I had received a wonderful, unexpected early retirement offer, and after discussing it with my family, had decided to take it. The shock on their faces was genuine and painful to see. There were immediate tears in the eyes of my assistant, Sarah, a fiercely competent single mom in her late 30s who was going through a nasty, protracted divorce and for whom I'd often bent the rules, allowing her flexible hours and time off for court dates. She didn't miss a beat, but her heart was breaking and my heart was aching for her. "But we need you, Martha," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion that tightened my own throat. "What will we do without you?" I said, "You'll be wonderful." I patted her hand, my heart aching with the necessary deception. "You're all smart and capable, and you know these protocols inside and out. I've taught you everything I know." I spent a full hour with them, walking them through the transition plan I'd drawn up, a final act of professional decency that also served my larger purpose. It made my departure look planned, considered, and entirely voluntary. Then, it was time for the main event. I went to the executive floor, the plush carpet swallowing the sound of my sensible heels. I told Rebecca's executive assistant, a young woman named Tiffany, who always looked like she was one sharp word away from a panic attack, that I had an answer for Miss Winters. She told me Rebecca was in a meeting. "That's perfectly fine," I smiled warmly, projecting an aura of infinite patience. "I'll wait." I sat in the cold, sterile waiting area for 20 minutes, calmly reading a copy of The Economist, as if I had all the time in the world. When Rebecca finally emerged, flanked by her two lieutenants, James and Michael, she seemed genuinely surprised to see me still there. I stood up, holding the glossy blue portfolio. "Rebecca," I said, my voice pitched to sound a little fragile, a little hesitant, "I've had a long talk with my daughter, and I've gone over your very generous offer. She thinks I should take it. She says I've worked long enough, and it's time I started enjoying my life." A wave of triumphant relief washed over her, so obvious it was almost comical. The predator had seen the prey walk willingly, gratefully into the waiting trap. "Rebecca, that's wonderful news," she gushed, her smile finally looking genuine because it was fueled by her own victory. "I'm so happy for you. We were so hoping you'd see it as the gesture of appreciation it was meant to be." James Parker, ever the sycophant, clapped me on the shoulder a little too hard. "Congratulations, Martha! Time to hit the golf course and work on that handicap." Michael Thompson, the weak link, just nodded, a bead of sweat glistening on his upper lip despite the Arctic air. He looked relieved, but also guilty. He couldn't quite meet my eye. I filed that away. His conscience was a vulnerability I could potentially exploit. I said, "I've signed the acceptance papers. My last day will be this Friday, if that's acceptable." Rebecca said, "Perfect," taking the folder from me as if it were a trophy. "Absolutely perfect. We'll have a small farewell cake for you in the main conference room on Friday afternoon, a proper send-off for a true Horizon legend."
"That's very kind of you," I said, my face a mask of humble gratitude. Inside, my mind was a steel trap running through a cold, hard checklist. Step 1. Lull the enemy into a false sense of security. Complete. I spent the next 3 days playing the part of the happily retiring employee to perfection. I cleaned out my desk with a sense of gentle nostalgia, boxing up personal photos and mementos. I gave my favorite, slightly overwatered office plant to Sarah. I endured the endless stream of condescending pats on the back and the saccharine goodbyes from colleagues who were either genuinely sad or secretly relieved to see the old guard go. At the farcical farewell party on Friday, I ate a small slice of cheap, overly sweet sheet cake and smiled graciously as Rebecca gave a speech full of empty, flowery platitudes about my decades of dedicated service and my role as the bedrock of this company. It was all I could do not to choke on the irony. But in the quiet moments, in the evenings after the office had emptied, I was making my final, critical moves. This was the opening. I didn't press. I didn't pry. I softened my voice, making it confidential, conspiratorial, the voice of someone sharing a hard-won secret. I made a terrible mistake once, when I was about your age, I began. I was working in the payroll department. This was long before I moved into compliance. My supervisor, a very intimidating man, asked me to reclassify some executive bonuses as operational expenses to help the department's budget look better at the end of the quarter. I knew it was wrong. It wasn't illegal, not really, but it was dishonest. But he was my boss. He talked about the importance of being a team player. He hinted about my upcoming performance review, about future promotions. He made it sound like my whole career depended on this one small act of cooperation. David was listening now, his whole body angled towards me. His sandwich was forgotten. So I did it, I confessed, letting a shadow of old shame cross my face. And he was right. No one ever found out. The company didn't go bankrupt. But I knew. It sat in my gut like a lead weight for years. Every time I saw that man in the hallway, I felt sick. I promised myself right then and there I would never, ever let anyone put me in that position again. I would rather lose my job than lose my self-respect. Because at the end of the day, David, it's the only thing you truly own. It's the one thing they can't take from you unless you give it to them. I wasn't threatening him. I was offering him a lifeline. I was showing him that I understood the pressure, the fear, the rationalizations. I was validating the moral turmoil I knew he was feeling. I was giving him a different definition of strength. I have kids, he said, his voice barely a whisper, thick with emotion. I have to think about them. The lawyer's fees for the custody case. Of course you do, I said, my voice full of a warmth and empathy that was entirely genuine. My husband and I, we always said that. And the best way to protect them is to make sure they have a father they can be proud of. A father who sleeps with a clear conscience at night. A father who teaches them that courage isn't about never being afraid. It's about doing the right thing even when you are. I gathered my purse and my book and stood up, smoothing down my skirt. It was good talking to you, David. I wish you all the best, with everything. I walked away without another word, without a backward glance. I had planted the seed. I had shown him a path out of the trap, a path that wasn't about defiance, but about integrity. Now all I could do was hope he was strong enough to take it. The next day, my last day, was a blur of fake smiles and hollow goodbyes. As I was doing my final walkthrough, saying farewell to my team, Sarah, my tearful assistant, pulled me aside. She pressed a small, plain, white envelope into my hand. She said, "David Chen from accounting asked me to give this to you," she whispered, her eyes wide with curiosity. "He said to tell you, thank you." I waited until I was in the quiet solitude of my car in the parking garage to open it. My heart was pounding. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't a note. It was a small, black USB flash drive. I didn't plug it in right away. I didn't need to. I knew what was on it with a bone-deep certainty. It was the original files, the unaltered reports, the truth. David Chen had made his choice. He had chosen his self-respect. Driving home, I felt a surge of something more powerful than hope. It was solidarity. Rebecca Winters thought she was battling one old woman. She had no idea she was facing an army built not on fear and greed, but on decency and quiet courage. And that was a force she would never, ever understand. The weekend after I left Horizon Technologies was one of the strangest and most tension-filled of my life. The house was preternaturally quiet. There were no emails to check, no urgent reports to review, no fires to put out. For the first time in 35 years, my professional life had come to a full and complete stop. But instead of feeling free, I felt like a coiled spring, a soldier in a foxhole waiting for the signal to attack.
On Saturday morning, I put on a simple dress, a headscarf, and a pair of sunglasses, a mild disguise that made me feel both foolish and professional. I drove to the public library in the next town over, a place where no one would know my face. I paid cash for a 2-hour guest pass to use their computer terminals, the kind encased in thick beige plastic and bolted to the desks. I sat down in a carrel between a teenager playing an online game and a man fastidiously researching Civil War battles. I took a deep breath and began the next phase of the operation. I created a new, anonymous email address, something deliberately generic and untraceable like concernedcitizen88@gmail.com. Then I composed a very short, very simple message. It was addressed to the senior managing partner at Deloitte, who headed the Horizon Technologies account, a notoriously thorough, old-school auditor named Arthur Davis. I knew his name and his reputation from years of working with his teams. He was a bloodhound when it came to numbers. He would find a tip this specific and technical irresistible. He wouldn't be able to ignore it. It would prey on his professional curiosity until he had no choice but to investigate. I read the email over 3 times, ensuring it was perfect. Then, with a quiet click of the mouse, I hit send. I immediately logged out, cleared the browser history and cache, and walked out of the library, leaving no trace. The line had been cast into the murky waters. On Monday morning, I was in my garden staking my tomato plants when my phone, sitting on the patio table, buzzed. It was a text from Sarah, my former assistant, who had promised to be my eyes and ears. "You are not going to believe this. The Deloitte auditors are here, the whole team, a whole week early. People are absolutely freaking out. Panic stations everywhere."
I smiled, a slow, grim smile of satisfaction. The fish were not just circling the bait, they were fighting over it. I spent the day in a state of suspended animation, forcing myself to go about the mundane tasks of a retiree. I pruned my rose bushes, I did a load of laundry, I listened to a podcast about British history. All the while, my mind was 20 miles away, picturing the chaos I knew was unfolding in the pristine, climate-controlled offices of Horizon. Around noon, Sarah texted again, her messages coming in a frantic burst. "They've taken over the main boardroom. They're calling it their command center. They've requested access to everything, the entire financial server. Michael Thompson looks like he's seen a ghost. He just snapped at me in the hallway for bringing him the wrong kind of coffee. He wanted a latte, I brought a cappuccino. I thought he was going to cry." Good. The pressure was building exactly as I had planned. The weak link was beginning to fray. Late in the afternoon, another text arrived. This one was more urgent, the tone palpably different. "Martha, I think they found something. Something big. I don't know what, but one of the auditors, a very stern-looking older man with a white mustache, just walked out of a meeting with Michael and went straight into James Parker's office. He didn't knock. The door is closed. This feels really bad." That would be Mr. Arthur Davies himself. He had found one of the vendor codes. He had pulled on the thread, and it had led him from the CFO to the COO. He was following the trail of breadcrumbs right up the chain of command. I knew what would happen next. They would try to contain it. They would try to manage him. Michael would blame a clerical error, a glitch in the new software. James would feign surprise and righteous indignation, promising a full internal review to get to the bottom of the unacceptable oversight. Rebecca, the master manipulator, would try to use her formidable charm and authority to redirect the auditor's attention, to bury them in mountains of irrelevant data. But they were dealing with Arthur Davies, a man who viewed balance sheets with the same deep-seated suspicion a homicide detective views a crime scene. And more importantly, they were dealing with a meticulously fabricated, multi-layered fraud. It was like a cheap suit. It looked fine from a distance, but up close, under the bright, unforgiving lights of a real audit,
The shoddy stitching, the mismatched patterns, and the cheap fabric were glaringly obvious. My final text from Sarah that day came just after 5 o'clock as I was washing the garden soil from my hands. Emergency meeting just called. Rebecca, James, and Michael are in the main boardroom with the entire in-house legal team. Looks incredibly serious. The door is closed, but everyone is whispering. I've never, ever seen it like this, Martha. It feels like the whole building is holding its breath. I put my phone down and went back to my garden. I snipped a perfect crimson-red rose, a variety called Mr. Lincoln that Robert had planted years ago. Its petals were like dark velvet, flawless and strong. They thought they had cut me out, pruned me from the vine like a dead branch. They didn't realize they had just given me the time and the space to tend to a very different kind of garden, one where the seeds of their own destruction, which I had so carefully planted, were beginning to bloom with a terrible and beautiful ferocity. The line was now taut. All I had to do was wait for them to make their next panicked and predictable move. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that they would. Tuesday was quiet, the proverbial calm before the storm. I received a short, elegantly worded email from Eleanor Blackwell confirming our tea for the following week at the Drake Hotel. She was a master of patience, giving me space, letting events unfold at their own pace. Sarah texted me intermittently from the office, painting a picture of an armed camp. The auditors are like machines, she wrote. They don't talk, they just work. They've requested employee rosters from HR. The executives are still locked in meetings with the lawyers. The atmosphere is beyond tense. It's toxic. They were circling the wagons, preparing their story, trying to find a plausible narrative to explain the inexplicable. The call came on Wednesday afternoon, just as I knew it would. I was on my knees in my back garden, wearing my old gardening clothes and a wide-brimmed sun hat, potting new hydrangea plants. My hands were covered in rich, dark, honest soil. The sun was warm on my back, a gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the big maple tree, and for a moment I felt a genuine, uncomplicated sense of peace. This was what retirement was supposed to be, this quiet communion with the earth. Then my phone, sitting on the weathered teak patio table, began to ring with a jarring insistence. The caller ID read, Horizon Technologies, main line. I took a deep, centering breath, my heart starting a low, steady drumbeat. I slowly got to my feet, wiped my hands on my soil-stained apron, and walked over to the table. I let it ring 2 more times. A small act of psychological warfare. Let them wait. Let them sweat. "Hello?" I said finally, my voice engineered to sound calm, pleasant, and slightly breathless from my gardening. "Martha, thank God! It's Mark Henderson!" Mark Henderson, the company's chief legal counsel, a slick, silver-haired man in his late 50s whom I had known for 20 years. A man who had always been professionally cordial to my face, but privately condescending, treating me and my department like a necessary but tedious bureaucratic hurdle. His voice, usually so smooth and confident, the voice of a man used to dominating every conversation, was strained, tight, and a little ragged around the edges. "How nice to hear from you, Mark," I said, infusing my tone with polite, gentle surprise. "How are things over at Horizon?" "Things are busy, Martha. Very busy. Listen, the reason I'm calling is we have a bit of a situation here." "Oh, dear," I said, with my voice full of the mild, detached concern of a distant acquaintance hearing about a fender bender. "I hope it's nothing serious." No, of course not," he lied quickly. A little too quickly. "Just a bookkeeping tangle, a real mess. The auditors are here, as you probably know." "Oh, are they?" I lied just as smoothly. "I thought they weren't due to arrive until next week. My, how time flies." There was a pregnant pause on the other end of the line. He knew that I had scheduled them. He knew that I knew the original date. We were already in a chess match, and he knew I was calling out his first clumsy move. Yes, well, they decided to come early, he said, clearing his throat with a loud, nervous rasp. And they flagged a few transactions from a few years back, legacy stuff. It's all perfectly above board, of course, but the documentation is incredibly complex. Frankly, Martha, you're the only one who has the historical knowledge to unpack it for them, to explain the context.
I almost laughed out loud. The historical knowledge. It was a beautiful, desperate euphemism for the only one who knows where all the bodies are buried because you helped bury some of them. I see, I said, letting the silence stretch. Here it comes, I thought, the desperate pitch. So, he continued, the false casualness ramping up to an almost comical degree. Rebecca and I were talking, and we've had a wonderful idea. We'd like to bring you back on as a special consultant, just for a few days, maybe a week, to help us clarify things for the auditors, to get them back on the right track. We would, of course, compensate you very, very generously for your time. We're authorized to offer a consulting fee of, say, $50,000? $50,000. A fortune to some. A profound, pathetic insult to me. It was hush money. It was a bribe. They weren't paying for my knowledge. They were paying for my complicity. They wanted to park me in that conference room next to them so I could use my credibility to spin their lies, to validate their forgeries, to make the whole nightmare go away. They wanted to buy my integrity for the price of a mid-range luxury car. I looked out at my beautiful, sun-drenched garden, at the life I was slowly, carefully building away from their world of corruption and deceit. I thought of the small black USB drive sitting safely in my desk drawer. I thought of Robert's honest, smiling face in the photograph by my bed. "Mark?" I said, and my voice was no longer just pleasant. It was firm. It was crystalline. It was the voice of the Director of Internal Compliance. "That's a very interesting offer." "Great!" He practically shouted, the relief in his voice palpable. He thought he had me. He thought the money had worked. "That's great, Martha. Can you come in tomorrow morning, 9 a.m.? "No, Mark," I said calmly. "I don't think so." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute, a vacuum of shock and disbelief. He was so sure he had me, the money, the appeal to my expertise and my ego. He thought I was a simple creature who could be easily flattered and bought. I don't understand." He finally stammered, his carefully constructed composure shattering into a million pieces. "Mark, I signed a retirement agreement last week. It was a comprehensive legal document. I'm sure you, as chief legal counsel, have reviewed it. My employment and all of my associated responsibilities to Horizon Technologies were officially and irrevocably terminated as of last Friday at 5 p.m. I no longer have any obligations to the company." "But, Martha, this is a crisis. We need you, the board." "That sounds like a problem for the current management," I said coolly, cutting him off. "After all, that's what they're paid for, isn't it? To manage the company's finances?" I didn't wait for a response. I didn't want to hear him beg. I didn't want to hear him threaten. The conversation was over. With a quiet, satisfying click, I ended the call. I stood there for a long moment on my sunny patio, the phone in my hand. A monarch butterfly, bright orange and black, landed on a rosebush. The sun was still shining. The world hadn't changed. But in that moment, I had taken back my power. They hadn't just tried to cheat me.
They had tried to use me as a tool to cover their crimes, and I had refused. It was a victory, clean and absolute, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my soul, that it was only the beginning. The summons for the board meeting came, as I knew it would, from Eleanor Blackwell's office. Her executive assistant called me on Friday morning, her voice crisp and professional, requesting my presence the following Monday at 10 a.m. The official reason, stated in the follow-up email, was to provide historical context on certain compliance matters arising from the preliminary audit. The real reason, the one that pulsed beneath the surface of the corporate jargon, was to watch the guillotine drop. I spent the weekend not in relaxation, but in preparation. I didn't prepare like a lawyer, assembling a mountain of evidence to overwhelm them. I prepared like a stage manager, or perhaps a surgeon. I reviewed the files on David's USB drive and cross-referenced them with my own meticulous records. I didn't prepare a grand, sweeping speech. I selected 5 key documents, 5 irrefutable, surgically precise pieces of evidence. Each one was a loaded gun, and I planned to fire them one at a time, with maximum impact. On Monday morning, I dressed for battle. I chose a simple, impeccably tailored, dark gray suit. It was a suit that radiated authority and seriousness. No soft lavender, no sentimental pearls. This was my armor. When I walked into the soaring marble and glass lobby of Horizon Technologies, the security guard at the front desk, a man named Gus, who had known me for years, did a visible double-take. He was used to seeing me as a familiar, friendly fixture. Today, he saw someone else. I just smiled, a cool, polite smile, and showed him the meeting request email from Eleanor's office on my phone. I was shown not to the main waiting area, but to a small private conference room adjacent to the main boardroom. A few minutes later, Eleanor came in to meet me. She was the epitome of grace and steel, dressed in a sharp navy blue dress that highlighted her silver hair. She took both my hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong. She could pour anything into the audience and make them expect chants to rise.
Rebecca, ever the performer, launched into a smooth, practiced speech about transitional challenges, aggressive growth strategies, and legacy systems that were being updated. She was trying to control the narrative, to frame this as a simple, if unfortunate, byproduct of progress. Eleanor let her speak for a few minutes, letting her dig her own hole a little deeper, before politely but firmly cutting her off. "Thank you, Rebecca. That's a very corporate explanation," Eleanor said, a distinct note of ice in her tone. "But perhaps we should deal in specifics rather than generalities. Martha, the auditors have a specific question about a new vendor named Apex Solutions. They appear to have received payments totaling just over $9 million over the last fiscal year. As this vendor was onboarded recently, perhaps you could shed some light on the due diligence process that was followed." All eyes in the room turned to me. I didn't look at my carefully arranged files. I looked directly down the long table at Rebecca. "Apex Solutions," I said, my voice clear and steady, carrying easily in the silent room. "Yes, I recall seeing the initial paperwork for them. As I remember it, they were presented to the compliance department as a high-level logistics consultant, brought in to streamline our European distribution network. Is that correct, Miss Winters?" I had thrown her a softball, a chance to build her own scaffold. She took it. "That's correct," Rebecca said, regaining a sliver of her usual confidence. She thought this was about procedural errors. "They are a top-tier firm based in Europe. Their work has been invaluable in increasing our Q3 and Q4 profit margins." "Invaluable," I repeated softly. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper. I slid it down the polished table to Frank Miller.
That's very interesting, because this is the official certificate of incorporation for Apex Solutions LLC. It was registered with the state of Ohio 6 months ago. The sole proprietor and registered agent is a Mr. Leonard Thompson. According to public records, he is a retired high school gym teacher who lives in a small town outside of Cleveland. I paused, letting the information sink in, watching the blood drain from Michael Thompson's face. He is also, I believe, Michael Thompson's older brother. A collective gasp, sharp and audible, went through the room. Michael made a small, strangled noise and looked as if he was about to be physically ill. That's a coincidence, Rebecca stammered, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape hatch that wasn't there. A very unfortunate coincidence. Is it? I asked calmly. I pulled out my second document. This is a bank statement from the corporate account of Apex Solutions, obtained via a legal subpoena by the auditors on Friday. It shows a wire transfer of $2 million made 2 months ago to another entity, a holding company called Nightingale Holdings. I turned my gaze to James Parker, who was now staring at me with naked hatred. Project Nightingale was your internal code name for the acquisition of the German warehouse facility, was it not, Mr. Parker? James opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish gasping for air. And Nightingale Holdings, I continued, my voice relentless, a calm, factual hammer chipping away at their wall of lies, is registered in the Cayman Islands. Its ownership is, of course, completely anonymous. I had them. I had connected the dots from a fake company run by a relative to a secret offshore slush fund. But I wasn't done. The fraud was one thing. I wanted to expose the malice, the personal cruelty that drove it. I wanted to expose the rot at the very top. Of course, I said, turning my full attention back to Rebecca, who now looked like a cornered animal. All of this could just be a series of unfortunate misunderstandings and poor judgments. A terrible mess, to be sure, but perhaps not a criminal conspiracy. Except for one thing. I pulled out my third document. It was a simple printout of an email. This is an email from you, Rebecca, to James Parker from your personal email account to his. The subject line is simple: the gatekeeper problem. In it, you discuss the need to accelerate the transition for a senior staff member whose outdated methods and unnecessary scrutiny were posing a significant risk to our Q4 profitability targets. You sent this email at 11:42 p.m. on the night of Monday, October 14th. The very next day, Tuesday, October 15th, you called me into your office and offered me that very generous early retirement package. Frank Miller, the chairman, slammed his open hand on the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. Is this true, Rebecca? This is an outrage, Rebecca finally exploded, finding her voice in a torrent of fury. This is a fabrication. This is a coordinated attack by a disgruntled former employee. She has falsified these documents to smear my name and destroy my reputation. It was the exact response I had anticipated. The last, desperate defense of the guilty, claimed to be the victim, and I was ready for it. I see, I said into the ringing silence that followed Rebecca's furious outburst. I calmly folded my hands on the table in front of me, a picture of serene, unshakable composure. So to be clear, Miss Winters, it is your position that all of these documents are forgeries. You believe that Mr. Thompson's brother, a retired gym teacher, just happens to be a multi-million-dollar international logistics consultant. You believe that Mr. Parker's secret project codename is coincidentally linked to an anonymous offshore account that received millions from that same consultant, and you believe that this email detailing your plan to remove me is a complete fake, created out of thin air. I let my gaze sweep across the stunned, grim faces of the board members, one by one. I saw doubt, I saw anger, and on the face of Frank Miller, I saw a cold, hard certainty forming. I settled my gaze back on Rebecca. Her eyes were blazing with a desperate, cornered animal fury. She still thought she could bluff her way out, that her force of personality could triumph over the mountain of facts. It's a very elaborate story you're suggesting, Rebecca. And for a moment, one might almost be tempted to believe that one woman, a disgruntled employee, could have the motive and the means to orchestrate such a complex and malicious lie. I paused, letting the weight of the moment build, letting the board members contemplate the sheer improbability of her claim. But it becomes very difficult to maintain that belief, doesn't it, when there's a corroborating witness? A flicker of genuine confusion crossed Rebecca's face. A witness? She thought this was all me, a one-woman crusade. She couldn't imagine that anyone in her carefully controlled kingdom would dare to cross her. She had underestimated me, and now she was about to find out she had underestimated someone else, too. I turned my head slightly towards the head of the table, making eye contact with Alona. Alona, who had been silent and watchful throughout the entire exchange, gave a crisp, almost imperceptible nod to the chairman's executive assistant, who was standing nervously by the boardroom door. The assistant, her hand trembling slightly, opened it. And David Chen walked in.
He wasn't a hero from a movie. He was a terrified young man in an ill-fitting suit that he had probably bought for a wedding or a funeral. He was clutching a slim black laptop briefcase as if it were a life raft in a stormy sea. His face was pale, his dark hair slightly disheveled, but his eyes, when he lifted them to look at the board, were resolute. He walked to the table and stood behind an empty chair, a silent, damning presence that immediately sucked all the oxygen out of the room. If Rebecca's face had been white before, it was now a ghastly, translucent shade of gray. The sight of David Chen, her own pawn, a person she considered so utterly insignificant she probably wouldn't have recognized him in the elevator, was a blow she had never, ever anticipated. This wasn't an attack from the past, from the old guard she had vanquished. This was a betrayal from within the ranks of her own new empire. It was the moment she knew, with sickening finality, that the game was truly over. "Mr. Chen," said Frank Miller, his voice heavy with a grim authority, "thank you for coming. Do you have something you wish to tell the board?" David swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his thin throat. He opened his briefcase and took out his laptop. He didn't look at Rebecca or Michael. He looked directly at Frank Miller and the other board members, his gaze sweeping across their faces. "For the past 6 months, I was instructed by Mr. Thompson on multiple occasions to alter financial reports before they were submitted for executive review. I was told it was standard practice for tax efficiency purposes." Michael Thompson made a strangled noise, a sort of half-sob, half-gasp, and buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "I was told to create new expense ledgers and backdate them to align with the altered reports. I was told to delete the original files from the server after the new ones were approved and archived. But I couldn't. I knew it was wrong. I made copies. I kept the originals." He turned his laptop around to face the board, his fingers hovering over the trackpad. "These are the original, unaltered reports. The real ones. They will show a direct discrepancy of over $9 million compared to the documents the auditors have been given. It's all here. Every last file." It was done. There was no argument left. There was no denial left. David's testimony was the final human nail in their collective coffin. It wasn't just about numbers and shell companies and emails anymore. It was about a young man, a father, whose integrity they had tried to steal and who had found the courage, against all odds, to take it back. I watched Rebecca. The fight, the fury, the arrogant defiance, it all drained out of her completely. Her shoulders, which had been squared with aggression, slumped in utter defeat. The mask of the Titan CEO shattered into a million pieces, revealing a scared, defeated woman. She stared at the polished surface of the mahogany table as if it were a deep, dark well she was about to fall into.
She had built her empire on fear and intimidation, and it had been brought down by the quiet courage of two people she had written off as powerless and insignificant. Frank Miller, slowly, deliberately, stood up, his face a grim mask of fury and disappointment. He looked at Rebecca, then at James, then at the weeping figure of Michael Thompson. Rebecca Winters, James Parker, Michael Thompson, on behalf of the Board of Directors of Horizon Technologies, you are all suspended, effective immediately. Please hand over your company identification, your keys, and all company electronics to security, who are waiting outside. We will be launching a full, independent investigation, and we will be cooperating fully with the relevant federal authorities. Then he turned his gaze down the long table to me, and for the first time I saw not just respect in his eyes, but a deep, profound, and humbling apology. Martha, on behalf of this entire board, I am so sorry. I simply nodded. I didn't need his apology. The battle was won. The aftermath was as swift and decisive as the confrontation had been. As we sat in the boardroom, the air thick with the ghosts of ruined careers, two discreet but imposing security guards entered. They quietly, professionally, escorted Rebecca, James, and Michael from the room. There were no dramatic scenes, no shouting matches, just a quiet, humiliating exit past the glass-walled offices of the employees they had lied to and stolen from. Within the hour, a terse, formal email announcing the immediate suspension of the three top executives hit the internal company server, sending shockwaves through every department. By the end of the day, it was the top story on Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, and every other financial news network. The Horizon Technology stock, predictably, went into freefall. The board asked me to stay. In the chaotic hours that followed the meeting, they offered me everything. Frank Miller, his face etched with a mixture of anger and relief, offered me a seat on the board itself. He offered me a newly created C-level position as Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, with a salary that was more than double what I had ever earned. And of course, they immediately guaranteed me the full, unadulterated retirement package I was owed, plus a significant, 7-figure settlement for damages, distress, and wrongful termination. A week later, after the initial storm had passed and an interim CEO had been appointed, I met with Eleanor and Frank in the same boardroom. The chairs where Rebecca and her cronies had sat were conspicuously empty. The atmosphere was somber but clean. "The offer stands, Martha," said Frank, his voice sincere and heavy with the weight of the past week. "This company needs you now more than ever. We need to rebuild the trust that was shattered. We need a leader who embodies the integrity that you never lost." I looked at them both, these powerful, influential people who were now looking to me as their corporate savior. A year ago, I would have accepted their offer in a heartbeat. It would have been the ultimate vindication, the final triumphant victory. I would have taken immense satisfaction in sitting Rebecca's chair, in undoing the damage she had done. But the past few weeks had changed me in a fundamental way. The fight hadn't just been about getting back what was mine. It had unearthed a deeper, more resonant purpose. Frank, Eleanor, I began choosing my words with care. I am deeply, truly grateful for your faith in me, and I will accept my full retirement benefits and the proposed settlement, because that is what I'm owed. That is justice, and I accept it. I took a deep breath, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over me. But I must respectfully decline the position on the board and the executive role. They were stunned into silence. Frank looked at Eleanor, then at me, his expression of complete confusion. "But why?" he asked. "This is your company. You saved it."
"It was my company," I corrected him gently, "and my time serving this particular institution is over. I spent 35 years of my life protecting its integrity from the inside. But what this ordeal has taught me is that the problem isn't just at Horizon. It's everywhere. In every industry, in every city, there are thousands of David Chens out there, good, honest people who are scared into silence by bullies and threats. There are thousands of Marthas, loyal employees, pushed out because they know too much or refuse to play the game. They don't have a powerful friend on the board. They don't have 35 years of evidence in a filing cabinet. They have nowhere to turn. I stood up, feeling a sense of freedom and clarity that was more valuable than any stock option or corner office. My fight isn't in this boardroom anymore. It's out there. And so, my real retirement, my real work, began. The story of the Horizon scandal eventually faded from the headlines, replaced by the next corporate drama, the next fallen CEO. The wheels of justice turned slowly, but they turned. Rebecca, arrogant to the last, refused a plea deal and was sentenced to 12 years in a federal prison for women. James Parker, ever the follower, got 8 years. And Michael Thompson, who cooperated fully with the prosecution and testified against his former bosses, received a reduced sentence of 5 years. I took the sizable settlement the company had given me, and instead of buying a beachfront condo in Naples or taking a luxury world cruise, I invested it. 6 months after that final board meeting, I stood at a small, crowded press conference in a rented room at a local hotel, not as a corporate executive, but as a private citizen. I announced the formation of the Reynolds Foundation for Corporate Ethics. Our mission is simple and direct. We provide confidential, pro bono legal aid, financial support, and a safe, anonymous harbor for corporate whistleblowers. We are the allies for those who dare to speak truth to power. We are the voice for the voiceless. My office today isn't a grand space in a skyscraper. It's a small, bright suite of rooms above a bookstore in a quiet suburb. My team is a handful of passionate, idealistic young lawyers and paralegals who believe in what we're doing. Our clients aren't multi-billion-dollar corporations. They are brave, terrified individuals who have everything to lose. Just this morning, I sat across my simple desk from a young woman, a brilliant chemical engineer from a major pharmaceutical company. She had tears in her eyes. She had discovered a fatal flaw in a new drug that was being rushed through FDA trials, a flaw her bosses had told her to bury in the data. She was afraid of losing her job, of being blacklisted in her industry, of the mountain of debt from her student loans. She had the same look of fear and helplessness in her eyes that I remembered seeing in my own reflection in the dark window of my dining room not so long ago. I reached across the desk and took her hand. I told her my story. I told her that she was not alone. I told her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to act in spite of it. I told her that we would fight with her and for her every step of the way. And as I saw the fear in her eyes begin to be replaced by a tiny, fragile spark of hope, I knew, with a certainty that filled my heart to bursting, that I had found my true calling. I didn't just get my retirement back. I didn't just get justice. I got my purpose back, stronger and clearer than ever before. I turned the deepest betrayal of my life into a shield for others. My name is Martha Reynolds, and my work is just beginning.